Hi, welcome to the Neot Kedumim lecture. And just before we start, the Neot Kedumim phone number is right here, and the website is here. And my name is Ellie Waller, and this is my phone number. If you have any questions whatsoever, I'd be happy to answer them, and I'll be putting up these details again at the end of the lecture. This lecture is entitled Nature in the Land of the Bible Between Pesach and Shavuot. The festival of Pesach or Passover we celebrated this year, mid-April, and the festival of Shavuot or Pentecost we will celebrate at the end of May. And here we have a photo that I took. Most of the photos in this presentation will be photos that I just took from my phone camera. And this lecture is also in honor of the festival of Lag BaOmer, which will be celebrated in Israel, which will soon be celebrated in Israel. This is a calendar from this year, and we can see that last night was the 11th of, tonight, excuse me, is the 11th of May. And hold on a minute. And here's a counting of the Omer calendar, and all of these terms will be explained. And last night we counted 32 days of the Omer, counting from Passover, Pesach, until Shavuot. Now, every single week in the synagogue, we read a portion from the 5 books of Moses. And this week, serendipitously, we read from Vayikra, from Leviticus. And we read all about the Omer, that from Pesach, from the second day of Pesach, you bring a sheaf of elevation offering, which is called the Omer. It's a quantity of barley. And thereafter you count 7 weeks, 50 days, until you count 50 days. And the Omer is all about the barley. And the barley ripens earlier than all the other crops. It ripens on Pesach. And in biblical times, before you could use your barley for yourself, you had to donate the first of your crop to the temple. The Omer was the barley offering that you would bring on the second day of Pesach. By counting the Omer, we remember that we were commanded to bring the barley offering, and we are enjoined to count for 49 days till Shavuot, when the wheat will be ready. And this picture is an example of a counter. Every day you would turn the wheel and it would tell you the next day of the 50 days that you were counting. Okay. We read the Song of Songs on Pesach, which is called Shir HaShirim in Hebrew, and we will read Megillat Ruth, or the Scroll of Ruth, on Shavuot. And what we see growing outside right now in Israel is reflected in these biblical texts. I'll try to give you a sense of what the biblical characters saw and how they were awed by the beauty of nature. Another photo that I took just yesterday. Each day when I walk in the hills near my home, I see the colors change from green to yellow. Over Pesach, there was still so much green everywhere, but now it's all changing to yellow. But there is still always beauty in my eyes. Much of the yellow is wild barley, and we can almost smell the fragrance of the fields when we read Megillat Ruth. The fragrance that can't be bottled or zoomed through the computer to you. You have to actually experience it, but hopefully I'll be able to give you a sense of what it's like. And here's a little video I made.
Wild oats and wild barley, wild carrots, hyssop, thyme leaf savoury, just to name a few.
Okay, hold on. So all of those things and more you would have seen in that video if you look closely. And here's some more pictures I just took yesterday. And there's everything here. You can see wild carrot, wild marjoram, dwarf chicory, yellow fleabane, holy thistle, Judean vipers, bugloss, and lots more. Fabulous stuff. Going back to the scroll of Ruth, Megillat Ruth, in the first chapter, it says, Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth the Moabite returned from the fields of Moab, and they came to Beit Lechem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And the Aramaic Targum, the Aramaic translation from the 3rd century, doesn't just translate the text, it also explains the text, and he expands upon this verse. And it says, it was Erev Pesach, which means the day before Pesach. And on that day, Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, began to harvest the Omer, barley, wave offering. Further on in the 2nd chapter of Ruth, it says, Ruth continued to glean in Boaz's field until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest. The Midrash Rut Rabbah, and the Midrash is a rabbinic explanation of the biblical text from the 6th century, says, from the beginning of the barley harvest till the end of the wheat harvest is 3 months. And here we have a picture of barley compared to a picture of wheat. In Tractate Menachot, which is a section of the Talmud, which was redacted between the 3rd and the 6th centuries, it says, the beginning of the barley harvest is connected to Pesach, and the start of the wheat harvest falls 7 weeks later and is connected to Shavuot. And this page is a photograph of that page of the Talmud. So the barley harvest begins on Chol Hamoed Pesach, the intermediary days of Pesach, with the bringing of the barley wave offering, and the wheat harvest begins after Shavuot with the bringing of the bread of the Bikurim, which was made of wheat. And I think I have to define my terms of what is Bikurim here. So the Bikurim were when the farmer's first fruits were brought as an offering to the temple. The Bikurim, the word in Hebrew Bikurim, tells us that everything new belongs to God. The word Bechor is also the word for your firstborn child. It's the first thing, the new thing. And you could bring your Bikurim, your harvest, from Sukkot, but not everything was ready until Sukkot, not everything was ready on Shavuot. You could bring it all the way as it ripened until Sukkot. And this is a picture of a archaeological find, an amazing archaeological find that was found in Gezer. And Tel Gezer, you can see on the map here, is just northwest of Jerusalem. It's actually very close to Neot Kedumim. When you come to visit Neot Kedumim, you can pay a visit to Tel Gezer. It's fascinating. And the calendar is from around the 10th century BCE, which is the time of King Solomon's reign. Now, what this calendar, which is written in stone, tells us is that it divides the year up into different months and into different harvests according to the different things that were growing. And it says that in March, they cut flax. In April, they would harvest the barley. And in May, they would harvest the other grains, which was the wheat. So dividing the harvest into two is something we also saw in the Gezer calendar. The word Gezer might ring a bell to some of you. It sounds like the common word in Hebrew for carrot, but it is actually a place. Okay. So the poet laureate, arguably the poet laureate of Israel, was a woman called Naomi Shemer, and she was very famous in Israel, singer-songwriter. She lived from 1930 to 2004, and this is her take on the agricultural calendar of Israel. She wrote a song, and in English it's translated as the 12 months in Israel, according to what's growing. And I'm going to play you just a very short section, which is about this time of the year. And I've highlighted in blue where it refers to the months that we're actually talking about. Nisan, which is the Hebrew month where we celebrate Pesach. Iyar, which is what we're in right now. And Sivan, which is coming in about 12 days from now. So listen to the song. It's a great song, and I urge you to listen to the whole thing on your own time. But I'll just tell you in English what we heard there. In Nisan, the month of Pesach, the scythes get hard to work in the field. In Iyar, everything flowers. True. And in Sivan, we bring the first fruits. Now, when I say we bring the first fruits in Sivan, that's a generalization for all of the land in Israel, but it really depends where your farm is, because Israel is comprised of hills and valleys and all kinds of different terrain. And in the Jordan Valley, for example, it gets very, very hot. But in the Galil and in the Jerusalem mountains, it's a much colder climate. So depending where you are, the different crops will grow at different rates. Okay. So back to the scroll of Ruth, Megillat Ruth, and we can read in chapter 2, she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now that is a lot of barley, believe me. Obviously Boaz, who owned the fields and saw Ruth, he gave her preferential treatment, and she was able to gather so much food. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 9, verse 2, it says, they have rejoiced before you as they rejoice at reaping time. Reaping time is harvest time. And here you have a picture of harvesting in the fields. And what this verse in Isaiah is telling you is that harvest time is very, very joyous. It's a very, very happy time when your crops are finished growing and you cut them down to bring them in. I want to talk a little bit more about Sfirat HaOmer. And here again, you have the picture of the device that helped you count the 50 days. And during these 50 days between Pesach and Shavuot, when we count the Omer, it's also a period of mourning in the Jewish calendar. What do I mean? You don't hold weddings. You don't traditionally have haircuts or shave. And the main, or listen to music, that's very important. And the main reason given is that in the 2nd century, the famous Rabbi Akiva, he had many, many students, and 24,000 students of his died at this period, during this period. And it was some sort of pandemic, which we can, sadly, which we can really relate to this year. In the Yalkut Shimoni, which was another midrash from the 13th century, another commentary from the 13th century, it says, after talking about how the word simcha, which means joy, is associated with Sukkot, it's talking about that in the 5 books of Moses, when you refer to the Feast of Tabernacles, that is Sukkot, you use the word chag, which means joy. Simcha, and that word is not written in association with Pesach. Why? And his answer was because on Pesach the produce is judged, and man does not know if he will have produce or if he will not. He doesn't know if all of his crops will succeed or if they will fail, and therefore the word simcha, joy, is not used. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, verse 8, we have a list of the 7 species with which the land of Israel is blessed. And here you have a picture of the 7 species. And this picture is actually from stamps that were produced in Israel by a very famous graphic artist called Tzvi Narkis, and because they were stamps that were produced in Israel, we're going to start on the right hand side and go towards the left, but the order of the 7 species is, and you can read it above, it is a land of wheat and barley and vines, grapevines and fig trees and pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. So these are the 7 species with which the land of Israel is blessed. Okay. All right, next. Now, all of the 7 species, I'm going to show you examples of all of them, but the last one is interesting. The generic term honey is used in Hebrew. It's called dvash. And the commentators weren't exactly sure what the verse meant when it said honey. And many of the commentators came down and said that when it says honey in this verse, it does not mean honey from bees, from flowers, but it means honey specifically from dates. And okay. So during this time between Passover and Shavuot is a critical time for all of the 7 species growth. Let's talk about wheat. Here you have a picture of wheat, and I've brought you an excerpt from the tractate Brachot of the Talmud, and I will give you a translation in a minute. But I just want to tell you that there's a wonderful Australian poet from the 1900s called Banjo Paterson, and he wrote a poem called The Song of the Wheat. And just one line from many lines says, "But the man who now by the land would thrive must his spurs to a ploughshare beat. Is there ever a man in the world alive to sing the song of the wheat?" This poem is really an ode to wheat. And here's a translation from that section of the Talmud. It says, "How much effort did Adam, the first man, exert before he found bread to eat?" It's hard for us to relate to because we just go to the supermarket and buy loaves of bread in plastic bags and bring them home and keep them, put them in the freezer, take a slice out of the packet, put it in the toaster. It's very easy for us. But the first man, Adam, he had to, he plowed and he sowed and he reaped and he sheaved and he threshed and he winnowed and he separated and he ground and he sifted and he kneaded and he baked and then he ate. And the rabbi who writes all of this in that section of the Talmud says, and I, on the other hand, wake up and find all of these prepared before me. It was very hard, even for the rabbis in the Talmud, to relate to the idea of exerting all that effort every day just to get your daily bread. Okay. Now here we have a picture of barley on the left and wheat on the right, and you can really see the difference between them. And barley, although over time barley came to be considered a less important crop than wheat, and it was thought of as food that was better suited to animals than to man, we learn in Megillat Ruth, in the scroll of Ruth, that during this biblical period, barley was a very important crop for food for people. So you can see that the barley has longer hairs. Barley in Hebrew is called seorah, which sounds like sear, which is hair. It has longer hairs. And also the kernels are elongated. And another difference is that unlike wheat, after you thresh the wheat, the chaff comes off. After you thresh the barley, the chaff still remains on the seed of the wheat. On the wheat grain, sorry, not the seed. Okay. There's a very interesting story from the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin, which talks about Cleopatra. There's about three mentions of Cleopatra in the Talmud, and this is one of them, and it goes like this. It's a little bit saucy, so I hope it's okay. Queen Cleopatra asked Rabbi Meir a question. She said, I know that the dead will live, as it is written, and may they blossom out of the city like grass of the earth, as it says in Psalms 72. Just as grass grows, so too the dead will come to life. They're having a deep and meaningful discussion about resurrection, about the afterlife, because as we know in Egypt, they strongly believed in the afterlife. So Cleopatra asks, but when? Just as grass grows, so too the dead will come to life. But Cleopatra goes on to say, but when they arise, will they arise naked, or will they arise with their garments? Rabbi Meir said to her, it is derived a fortiori from wheat. He was not drawn into her salaciousness. He says, we learn a kal v'chomer from chita, from wheat. If wheat, which is buried naked, meaning that the kernel is sown without the chaff, emerges with several garments of chaff, several coverings, all the more so will the righteous who are buried with their garments arise with their garments. So there, Cleopatra. You should know that queens in Egypt were often worshipped as incarnations of Isis. And the historical Cleopatra VII developed a personal cult as Isis, Aphrodite. She considered herself and wanted her subjects to think of her as a deity. Remember that Shakespeare wrote a play about Antony and Cleopatra. Okay. So I'm talking about each of the 7 species in turn, and now we're up to vines. And it says in the Song of Songs, it says in chapter 2, V'hagefanim smadar natnu reach. The vines in blossom give off a fragrance. And check out this picture. I'm very proud of this picture that I took with my phone camera. You can see over here that you can see the tiny white little lines. They are the nascent buds of the blossom of the grape. And there's a very special name for the flower of the grapevine in Hebrew. It's called smadar. It is only used in the Song of Songs. It's a hapax, only used in this text. And because the flower of the grapevine is so unusual. But what I want to tell you is the fragrance. It's true. Song of Songs is right. You have to go out now in Israel if you can, or if you're not in the land of Israel, find a grapevine when it flowers in your region and stick your nose as close as you can into the flowers and smell the wonderful fragrance. It's heavenly. It's a little addictive. You like to smell it. I like to smell it whenever I can, but it's very, very delicate. It's not heavy or cloying. It's just refreshing. It's gorgeous. But as I've said, it depends in Israel where you are, what stage the grapevine will be at, because around Neot Kedumim region where I live, it's already blossoming, but in a colder climate you might not have reached this stage yet. Figs, and here we have some young figs. I took this picture about a week ago. And we know that figs will ripen from Shavuot until Sukkot. And we know the famous verse that in the Bible, several times in the Bible, it says, "Let every man sit under his vine and his fig tree," which is a symbol of utter tranquility, being able to just sit under your vine and your grapevine and under your fig tree and just enjoy your fruit. And here we have the showstopper, the pomegranate. Ain't nothing like it. It is the most beautiful, in my opinion. I know you shouldn't play favorites. Look at the color, look at the shape, look at those yellow stamens just bursting with pollen, ready to be pollinated to produce the pomegranate fruit. And here we have a picture of the olive tree and the tiny olive flowers which are falling off all over olive trees around where I live, and you can see the teeny tiniest little olives starting to grow. The main use of olive oil in biblical times was for the oil which was used for light. Here I've brought you a picture of a candle, an oil holder from around this is what it looked like in Hasmonean times, around the Second Temple period. Okay. And here we have the date palm. If honey refers to dates, as the commentators tell us, here's the date palm. And what happens is the dates fall off the trees in the summertime. You boil them up, you get a thick brown syrup, which is delicious. And it was used instead in biblical times. We didn't have sugar. We didn't have white sugar as we know it today. If you wanted something sweet, your go-to would be the date honey. It's called silan now in Israel, which that's a word we've adopted from Iraq. Okay, again, we have the 7 species over here. And what I want to ask is, what is so special about the 7 species, and why were they stuck on saying the 7th of the 7 species when it says honey? Why were they so sure that it was date honey? So what's special about the 7 species? What's the common denominator between them? And why did these 7 make the cut? And what about all the other good things that are growing in the land of Israel? Why didn't they get onto this list? So the main thing that these 7 species have in common is that they all have a critical growth period in the period between Pesach and Shavuot, a critical time for these species. And as we are counting the Omer, the fate of the harvest of each of the 7 species is being decided. That was the big question. Why these 7? Okay. So I said that during this period of time between Pesach and Shavuot, we have dramatic changes in the weather. We have very hot days and very cold days. And if you've been to Israel at this time, you know what I'm talking about. Here we have a picture of a chamsin. What does that mean? A fierce hot wind, which brings dryness and soaring temperatures, can take place in this period of time. It's called chamsin, which is like the Arabic word, which means 50. Could be the 50 days between Pesach and Shavuot. And if the chamsin comes early, it can wreak havoc on the wheat crop. We also have thunderstorms during these 50 days. Cold north winds and lightning and floods. And if they come during this time, it can mean disaster for the crops. As it's written in the book of Samuel, book 1 of Samuel, chapter 12, is it not the wheat harvest today? I will call to the Lord, and he shall send thunder and rain, and you may know and see your wickedness is great. The people were punished. They just harvested their wheat, and then there was a thunderstorm, and it was a disaster, because when rain falls on the crop, when it's been harvested, it can make it go moldy, and it can ruin your harvest. Olive flowers also need a hot wind after the flowers have bloomed. They need a hot wind after the flowers have bloomed. And this is a very important text, again from the Gemara, from the Talmud, from Tractate Bava Batra. It says, a north wind, here you have a compass with showing north, is good for the wheat when they are a third grown, and bad for the olives when they flower. The north cold wind. But a south wind, a hot wind, is bad for the wheat after it is a third grown, and good for the olives when they have flowered. And a sign to remember this, says the Gemara, that a table is in the north. What does that mean? This is a blueprint of the tabernacle, which is described in the book of Exodus. And it tells us that the table where the bread, which was made of wheat, was brought to the temple, was in the north of the tabernacle, and the candelabra, the menorah, which was lit by the olive oil, was in the south of the tabernacle. And the blueprint of the tabernacle is what was used when they laid out the temple in later times. So the table is in the north and needs the colder temperatures, and the olives are in the south and they need the warmer temperatures. That same north wind can be a blessing for the wheat when it is a third grown, when it is still green and unripe, but at the same time it can be disastrous for the olives if they have already flowered, if they have bloomed but yet have not been pollinated. The hot south wind is good for the olive crop, but it can destroy the grain harvest. Okay. Here we have loads of pictures of idols from the land of Israel. In ancient times, there was a great temptation to worship idols, many idols. Each god was associated with a different natural phenomenon. The contrasting climatic conditions, which were responsible for the fate of the crops, made it easy for people to see each force of nature as warring superpowers, supernatural powers. And I've brought you an excerpt from Shakespeare, from The Tempest, where it's called a masque, this particular part of the play, where all of the gods are brought in and they are all responsible for different parts of nature. And it goes, Ceres, most bounteous lady, thy rich lees of wheat, rye, barley, vetches, oats and peas, thy turfy mountains where live nibbling sheep. And it goes on. But what it's trying to say is that the gods in ancient times were responsible for nature. The Bikurim. We talk about them in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, where it says, and you shall take the first fruits of the fruit of your land. But we don't know which fruits that meant. Which fruits were you meant to bring to the temple as your Bikurim? And the Mishnah in Bikurim solves that conundrum, and it teaches the halacha. You only bring the Bikurim from our 7 species. And it's interesting because in the liturgy, you seldom have a text which you can take neat from the Bible and just use in your liturgy. However, there is something called the Mikra Bikurim, which you just cut from Deuteronomy and pasted when you brought your Bikurim, when you brought your first fruits to the temple. And this is the text that I've translated. And the main part I've written over here, and it says, my father was a fugitive Aramean. In Hebrew, Arami Oved Avi. And that might ring a bell to some of you, and for good reason, because in the Haggadah, we actually say part of this very same text, Arami Oved Avi, but we cut part of the text from Deuteronomy off during the Seder night. Okay, this graphic looks a little bit like a cigarette box. Sorry about that. Here we have a Haggadah, the portion of where we say the Arami Oved Avi, and I'm showing you over here the part that we don't say from Deuteronomy. We don't say on Seder night, and you shall bring it to this place, which is Israel, and God gave us this land flowing with milk and honey, and now I bring the first fruits of the land which were given to me by God. It's interesting that we don't talk about coming into the land of Israel and bringing the fruits on Seder night, on Pesach, and you can wonder why we don't say this part of the text. And a pretty convincing explanation that I've heard is that on Seder night, on Pesach, we're focusing on being redeemed from Egypt. We're not yet, and we're very, very happy about that, on being free men. We're not yet ready to talk about coming into the land of Israel. That will be later. First, we want to focus on our freedom. So going back to the text in Deuteronomy, where it says, the last line says, the first fruits of the land which were given to me by God. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Okay. The Mikra Bikurim highlights the connection between the fruit and God who gave us that fruit. The Mikra Bikurim, this text of Deuteronomy, forces people to say, here, I have brought my first fruits that were given to me by God. And this is a picture that I just took of the weather app of my phone of this week in Israel. And you can see that last Shabbat, it was 23 degrees and it rained. And next Shabbat, it's going to be 31 degrees. I think it's actually going to be hotter. I checked today. And it's going to be really, really hot. Really, really hot. And so that's just telling you again that the weather is really full of flux at this point in time. So again, here we have 7 species, and the verse is in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 10, it says, "Beware lest you forget God and do not keep his commandments." We bring the 7 species as the Bikurim on purpose to emphasize that there are special climactic hardships connected with the 7 species that were not present in Egypt, nor of course in the desert. The success or failure of the crops of the 7 species is sometimes just a matter of timing or of 1 or 2 days. The stage of the flower to fruit of all of the 7 species is the most delicate time in the growth of the fruit. The 7 species symbolize more clearly than any other fruit that there are delicate agricultural conditions in the land of Israel at this time of year. These conditions could easily cause people to worship many idols, as each idol was responsible for each different weather condition. Dealing with these difficult agricultural conditions was an ongoing daily test for the children of Israel. They had to believe that only the one true God was responsible for all of nature. So the Torah emphasizes in the verse, and it says, "Beware, again, lest you forget God and do not keep his commandments." Okay, here we have my pictures of the 7 species again. And now I want to cut to something completely different. Does anyone recognize this plant? I took this picture just around the corner from where I live. This plant was growing out of the wall. And when I passed it about a month ago, it looked like a dry, dead twig. But look how, now that the weather's warming up, it has just gone nuts. The stems have become red, ruddy, and there's loads of leaves and loads of buds and loads of flowers. Does anybody recognize what it is? Yeah, it's a caper bush. A caper bush. And the caper bush, it says in the Gemara, in the Talmud, is the toughest plant. It's called in Hebrew, it's salaf. And it says, af az be'ilanot. It is the toughest plant for the toughest times. And I'm going to show you another picture. I'm so proud of this picture. This is a flower of the caper bush, which blooms at night when it's cooler, and it only lasts about 12 hours. It's gone around, I took this about 6:30 in the morning, and it will be blown by 10 o'clock in the morning. And the caper flower is actually the symbol of Neot Kedumim, the biblical landscape reserve. You can see a stylized version of the flower over here that was drawn by that same graphic artist, Svi Narkis, and very, very faithful to the flower. And why is it the symbol of Neot Kedumim? Why is it a poster flower of all the flowers that are referred to in the Bible? Because just as this plant in the winter months, when it is dormant, almost looks like it's dead, and it can grow out of a wall and it comes to life in the summer months, it's a symbol of resilience. It's a symbol of able to sustain yourself in tough times. Neot Kedumim, this stunning nature reserve, when it was first established in the 60s, it was completely barren. It was no man's land. There was nothing growing here. After centuries of over-agricultural use and of warfare and other reasons, there was nothing growing here. And yet, when you walk around Neot Kedumim today, as I really hope you will come and visit, when you walk around Neot Kedumim, It's one of the most beautiful nature reserves in Israel. It's stunning, it's flourishing, and just like the caper bush. We're going through tough times in the world with the coronavirus pandemic, and it's affecting all of us. And it's also having a dramatic effect on our beloved Neot Kedumim. We have taken a beating, and we had to close for a long period of time. And we've just started an emergency fundraising campaign. And if you go to our link to our website or on our Facebook page, you'll see there's a donate page. And if you can see it in your hearts to donate any sum whatsoever, it will be gratefully received. We really need it. So, and I want to thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for that. And once again, I want to show you that this is the phone number for Neot Kedumim. This is the website. There's also a Facebook page. You just write Neot Kedumim. This is my name, Ellie Waller, and my phone number if you have any questions whatsoever. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope to see you again at Neot Kedumim soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.